A declassified CIA document called the Adam and Eve story has generated much controversy over predictions of an upcoming pole shift, aka crustal displacement, and catastrophic events that may sweep the planet in the not-distant future. The 57-page document is based on a book authored by Chan Thomas in 1963. Thomas proposed a pole shift scenario that differed in significant ways with what Charles Hapgood had earlier proposed in his pioneering 1958 book, The Earth-Shifting Crust. Hapgood's theory, which was endorsed at the time by Albert Einstein, posed that the geophysical poles periodically move by as much as up to 40 degrees through crustal displacements. This phenomenon was brought about by the increasing weight of the polar ice caps, which accumulate more and more ice over the millennia until they eventually generate sufficient centrifugal force due to the planet's rotation. Make the crust move over the mantle, as Einstein explained in the book's foreword. In the Adam and Eve story, Chan proposed that the pole shift was much greater, as much as 90 degrees, with the poles shifting into the equatorial zone in less than a day. Chan has proposed the poles would flip back and forth in this way so that Antarctica would eventually return to the South Pole region, and the Arctic would do likewise.
With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, throbbing, then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of seawater more than 2 miles high, then starts its race eastward. With the force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks, ripping, shredding everything in its supersonic bombardment. The unbelievable mountain of Pacific seawater follows the wind eastward, burying Los Angeles and San Francisco as if they were but grains of sand. Nothing but nothing stops the relentless, overwhelming onslaught of wind and ocean. Across the continent, the 1,000-mile-per-hour wind wreaks its hell, its unholy vengeance, everywhere, mercilessly, unceasingly. Every living thing is ripped into shreds while being blown across the countryside, and earthquakes leave no place untouched. In many places, the Earth's molten sublayer bleaks through and spreads a sea of white-hot liquid fire to add to the Holocaust. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of seawater moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. In a fraction of a day, all vestiges of civilization are gone, and the great cities Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York, Boston are nothing but legends. Barely a stone is left where millions walked just a few hours before. A few lucky ones who manage to find shelter from the screaming wind on the lee side of a high mountain peak such as Mt. Massive watch the sea of molten fire breaking through the quaking valleys below. The raging waters follow at supersonic speeds, piling higher and higher, steaming over the molten earth fire, and rising almost to their feet. Only great, high mountains such as this one can withstand the cataclysmic onslaught. North America is not alone in her death throes. Central America suffers the same cannonade wind, earth fire, and inundation. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by nature in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, and western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake. The Andes are piled higher and higher by the Pacific's supersonic onslaught as it surges over itself against the mountains. The entire continent is burned by molten earth fire, buried under cubic miles of catastrophically violent seas, then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. Europe cannot escape the onslaught. The raging Atlantic piles higher and higher on itself, following the screeching wind eastward. The Alps, Pyrenees, Urals, and Scandinavian mountains are shaken, then heaved even higher when the wall of seawater strikes. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath, under savage attack by wind and ocean. The area bounded by Zaire, South Africa, and Kenya suffers only severe earthquakes and winds little inundation. Survivors there marvel at the sun, standing still in the sky for nearly half a day. Eastern Siberia and the Orient suffer a strange late indeed, as though a giant subterranean scythe sweeps away the Earth's foundations, accompanied by die wind in its screaming symphony of supersonic death and destruction. As the Arctic basin leaves its polar home, eastern Siberia, Manchuria, China and Burma are subjected to the same annihilation as South America: wind, earth fire, inundation, and freezing. Jungle animals are shredded to ribbons by the wind, piled into mountains of flesh and bone, and buried under avalanches of homogenized seawater and mud. Then comes the sudden, seemingly infinite supply of terrible, instantly paralyzing temperature drop of 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Not man, beast, plant, muck, earth, nor water is left unfrozen in the entire eastern Asian continent, most of which remains below sea level. Antarctica and Greenland, with their ice caps, now rotate around the Earth in the torrid zone, and the fury of wind and inundation marches on for 6 days. During the 6th day the oceans start to settle in their new homes, running off the high grounds. On the 7th day the horrendous rampage is over. The Arctic Ice Age is ended and a new Stone Age begins. The oceans, the great homogenizers, have laid down another deep layer of mud over the existing strata in the Great Plains, as exposed in the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, Monument Valley, and the Badlands. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Greenland and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially, find their ice caps dissolving madly in the tropical heat. Massive walls of water and ice surge toward the oceans, taking everything from mountains to plains and gushing, heaving paths, while creating immense seasonal moraines. In less than 25 years the ice caps are gone, and the oceans around the world rise over 200 feet with the newfound water. The torrid zone will be shrouded in a fog for generations from the enormous amounts of moisture poured into the atmosphere by the melting ice caps. New ice caps begin to form in the new polar areas. Greenland and Antarctica emerge with verdant, tropical foliage. Australia is the new, unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. New York lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, shattered, melted by earth fire, and covered by unbelievable amounts of mud. Of San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas and Boston, not a trace is left. They all will join the legends of the 7 cities of Cibola. What's left of Egypt emerges from its Mediterranean inundation, new and higher still the land of the ages. The commonplace of our time becomes the mysterious Baalbek of the new era. A new era. Yes, the cataclysm has done its work well. The greatest population regulator of all does once more for man what he refuses to do for himself and the planet on which he lives, and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. After this cataclysm we join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu and Olympus, and Jesus joins Osiris, Taaroa, Zeus and Vishnu. Noah? Adam and Eve? Vishnu? Osiris? What do they have in common? They represent eras ages apart, and yet, somehow, they all join hands in the next cataclysm and walk with us. There are others who walk with us too, men of science long forgotten, those who first saw that these tumbles, these cataclysmic catastrophes, or revolutions of the Earth's shell have happened before, countless times. J. André de Luc in 1779 and Georges Cuvier in 1812 were the foremost. Dolomieu, the famous mineralogist, joined the consensus, as did Escher and Farrell, the Swiss geologists, also J. André de Luc Jr. and von Buch. They all agreed that the cataclysms were caused by sudden revolutions in the wrong direction by the surface of the Earth. Cuvier, in his Theory of the Earth, first published in 1812, based his conclusions on his unparalleled high relative research in stratigraphy, comparative anatomy, and paleontology. As a matter of fact, Cuvier was the founder of the science of comparative anatomy, based on his pioneering, self-taught work in that field. At that time he wrote, "Every part of the Earth, every hemisphere, every continent, exhibits the same phenomenon. There has, therefore, been a succession of variations in the economy of organic nature. The various catastrophes which have disturbed the strata have given rise to numerous shiftings of this continental basin. It is of much importance to mark that these repeated eruptions and retreats of the sea have neither been slow nor gradual. On the contrary, most of the catastrophes which occasion them have been sudden, and this is especially easy to be proved, with regard to the last of these catastrophes, I agree, therefore, with millimeter DC Luke and Dolomieu in thinking that if anything in geology be established, it is that the surface of our globe has undergone a great and sudden revolution, the date of which cannot be much earlier than 5 or 6,000 years ago. Also, one preceding revolution at least had put the continents under water, perhaps 2 or 3 eruptions of the sea. These alternations now appear to me to form the problem in geology that it is of most importance to solve. In order to solve it satisfactorily, it would be necessary to discover the cause of these events. These ideas have haunted, I may almost say have tormented me, during my researches among fossil bones. Researches which embrace but a very small part of those phenomena of the age preceding the last general revolution of the globe, and which are yet intimately connected with all the others. Many attempts have been made to answer the charge made to the geological profession by Cuvier to explain these sudden revolutions in the wrong direction. Among others, Velikovsky tried it through his studies High Myths and Legends, Hapgood tried it, Hugh Brown attempted, and in the process amassed a tremendous library of geological data. Every time the cataclysmic concept has risen, the beast has been stoned, burned at the stake, beaten to a pulp, and buried with a vengeance, but the corpse won't stay dead. Each time, it raises the lid of its coffin and says in sepulchral tones, "You will die before I." The latest of the challengers is Professor Frank C. Hibben, who in his book, The Lost Americans, said, "This was no ordinary extinction of a vague geological period which fizzled to an uncertain end. This death was catastrophic and all-inclusive, what caused the death of 40 million animals. The corpus delicti in this mystery may be found almost anywhere. Their bones lie bleaching in the sands of Florida and in the gravels of New Jersey. They weather out of the dry terraces of Texas and protrude from the sticky ooze of the tar pits off Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. The bodies of the victims are everywhere, we find literally thousands together, young and old, foal with dam, calf with cow. The muck pits of Alaska are filled with evidence of universal death, a picture of quick extinction. Any argument as to the cause must apply to North America, Siberia, and Europe as well. Mammoth and bison were torn and twisted as though by a cosmic hand in a godly rage. In many places the Alaskan muck blanket is packed with animal bones and debris in trainload lots: mammoth, mastodon, bison, horses, wolves, bears, and lions. A faunal population, in the middle of some cataclysmic catastrophe, was suddenly frozen, in a grim charade. Supernatural winds, volcanic burning, inundation and burial in muck, preservation by deep freeze of both torn-up animals and muck. Any good solution to a consuming mystery must answer all of the facts, challenges Hibben. The challenge wouldn't leave me alone. Like a hunger, it gnawed at my subconscious. I could hear the deep tones of Cuvier's challenge, find the cause of these events, still reverberating through the sacred halls of science, ghostly, unanswered. I felt Hibben's challenge, prodding, answer all of the facts. I decided that this cataclysmic concept, this catastrophic end which visits our planet time after time, needed verification or refutation once and for all. The first step was to gather all of the known, accepted data from as many sciences pertaining to our planet as possible: stratigraphy, archaeology, radiology, anthropology, paleontology, and oceanography, plus cosmology and astronomy and seismology and oceanography and paleolanguages such as prehistoric Mayan. Even evolution could not be ignored. Further, cross-correlation of the data between the sciences had to be honored. All of the foregoing gave the answer. Although there is enough data in most sciences to indicate that these cataclysms happen, there was not enough in each science to derive the process or prove the concept, but between science cross-correlation showed indeed that the concept was true. Not only did it verify that the events have happened, but disclosed when the last 5 cataclysms were and what positions the shell of the Earth has been in for the last 35,000 or more years. This was a first-time effort for certain. So, after years of research, beginning in 1949, Cuvier's challenge had an answer. Yes, indeed, cataclysms do happen, but I had not yet found the answer to his challenge: find the cause of these events. It would take me 20 more years to find the cause, the trigger of cataclysms. What makes them start? And further, exactly what is it that happens after it starts? What is the process of a cataclysm? Finally, What is the timetable of cataclysms? It was obvious already from the data that it was nonlinear. Was it a mathematical function that we could derive from the data? Or is it random and frustrating in its unpredictability? The more learned, the more to be discovered and learned. Meanwhile, what a chase! And what a dramatic story of the Earth's history we uncovered, civilizations of more than 20,000 years ago more advanced than our wildest imagination, prehistoric legends from Greece, Egypt, India, and South America which became history instead of legend, lost continents in the Atlantic and Pacific which became dated realities, with logical reasons for their sudden disappearance. Yes, Vishnu came alive, a man who lived through a cataclysm many thousands of years ago, actually 10 cataclysms ago. Now, he is known as the Hindu god of 10 resurrections from the waters. Osiris was rediscovered, he was the Jesus of his time, a man of Egypt, some 15,000 years ago. Noah smiled at us from the pages of the Epic of Gilgamesh, he actually was a Sumerian named Utnapishtim, who lived just around 7,000 years ago. The ark he built is more than legend. The process of a cataclysm is known now. Look at the cross-section of the Earth inside the front cover. You'll see 2 molten layers, the yellow ones. The important one is the thin molten layer starting 60 miles down, extending 60 miles deeper to 120 miles below the surface of the Earth. The thick, deep molten layer, starting 1,800 miles down at the bottom of the mantle, and extending 1,300 miles deeper, is the outer core. Seismology has proven these 2 yellow layers to be molten, and they are white-hot. Over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The outer, 60-mile thick layer is the one which supplies the volcanoes with the molten lava they spew forth.
Inside the Earth, the electrical and magnetic structure of the interior makes these layers act as if they were near solid or plastic. As long as the interior magnetic and electrical structure of the Earth maintains its orderliness, this old Earth keeps on rotating on its axis in a normal manner. If anyone doubts that Antarctica's ice cap is growing, it has been proven that it is growing at the rate of a Lake Ontario per year. So is Greenland growing. Since they are not centered on the Earth's axis of rotation, they develop centrifugal forces coupling with each other, in a direction perpendicular to the Earth's axis. It's like swinging a bucket of water around yourself on a rope. The water stays in the bucket. If you did not have the restraining rope, the bucket and water would fly away. In the case of the ice caps, the restraining rope is gravity, which keeps these 2 ice caps landlocked. Since these ice caps therefore cannot fly away, they resolve their problem by trying to pull the entire shell of the Earth above the 60-mile thick molten layer around the interior of the Earth. As long as the electrical and magnetic structure is maintained inside the Earth, the ice caps cannot pull the shell around to let them to go to the equator, and we maintain our orderly daily, monthly, yearly rotation. Right now we don't know why, every few thousand years on a varying timetable, the magnetic and electrical orderliness in the shallow molten layer is disorganized. Further, it is not known by what means it is disrupted. It has to be a way which lowers those energies to the extent that the shallow molten layer is allowed to act as a free liquid, letting the molten layer act as a molten liquid which then serves as a lubricant for the ice caps to pull the shell around the Earth's interior so as to have the ice caps shift about 90 degrees into the torrid zone. In 1/4 to 1/2 a day, the geographic poles move to the torrid zone, and all hell lets loose. The atmosphere and the Earth's oceans and lakes don't shift with the shell, they just keep on rotating west to east, and at the equator that speed is about 1,037 miles per hour. It has to be, normally, to make 1 revolution per day. So, while the shell shifts with the poles going to the equator, the winds and oceans continue eastward, blowing and flooding across the Earth at supersonic speeds, inundating continents with water miles deep, destroying everything with which man ever dealt, including himself. That's a summary of the process. Now what about the trigger? This turned out to be the most elusive piece of the whole puzzle. We couldn't rely on some supernatural assumption like sometime happenings in the heavens of a vague character which actually violated the laws of nature. No, it had to be something natural, a part of nature's ordinary structure, which disrupts the Earth's inner electrical and magnetic structure whenever a cataclysm happens. It also has to be a kind of happening which decreases the inner electrical and magnetic forces to the extent that they cannot support keeping the shallow molten layer acting as if it were plastic or near solid. We once thought that severe sunspots could be the cause, because they do disrupt the Earth's inner electrical and magnetic structure, but we were wrong. The time wasted on that assumption was the price in dealing in assumptions rather than facts. It was a bad detour to take. What was necessary was to be patient, to take more time, to assemble more facts, and use our most valuable tool, analytical reasoning. The solution, whatever it might be, would come. The derivation of the process gave us a greater understanding of prehistoric events. For instance, you can see that ice ages are not a matter of advancing and retreating ice, it's simply that different areas of the Earth are in polar regions at different times, for different dilutions of time, changes between positions take place in a fraction of a day, and the accompanying supersonic deluges deposit the various huge stratas we find in the walls of the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, Monument Valley, the mountains around Mexican Hat, Canyon de Chelly, and the Moqui Dugway. The story around the world gives silent testimony. 1. The Beresovka mammoth, frozen in mud, with buttercups in his mouth. 2. The age of the gorges below Niagara Falls and St. Anthony's Falls, both about 7,000 years. 3. The sudden end of the Laurentian Basin ice cap in Canada, about 11,500 years ago. 4. The uninterrupted evolution on the Galapagos, over 11,000 years. 5. The geological datings in the Murrumbidgee River Basin system in Australia, showing the end of an ice cap there about 11,500 years ago. 6. The age of fossil bones taken from the Wilshire Boulevard tar pits, over 11,000 years. 7. The sudden end of all work in the prehistoric city of Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, 11,500 years ago. 8. Leonard Woolley's great work in the Holy Land, dating Noah's flood at about 6,000 years ago. 9. The end of the Wisconsin ice cap, about 29,000 years ago. 10. The sudden 200-foot rise of the oceans all over the world, about 7,000 years ago. 11. The sudden rise of the St. Lawrence River bed 7,000 years ago. 12. The changing levels of the shoreline of the Hudson Bay in Canada. 13. The huge granite blocks from the Alps, sitting on the eastern slopes of the Jura Mountains at 4,000 feet above sea level. 14. The great legendarian Fraser's uncovering of over 8,000 verified separate inundation survival legends in the Malay Peninsula region. 15. The Pajark Marsh in Australia, which shows a quick extinction of many species, including humans, 11,500 years ago. 16. The Piri Reis map, showing the North Pole in Egypt. 17. The Egyptian water clock, showing agreement with the Piri Reis map. 18. Granite on top of the mountains around Death Valley in California. 19. The great stratifications of the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, Monument Valley and Badlands, each layer homogeneous, showing it to be deposited there suddenly by fantastic amounts of super-swift water. 20. The present growth of the Antarctic ice cap, approximately 293 cubic miles of ice per year. 21. The legends from primitive man in Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America of the day the sun set in the wrong direction. 22. The legends from primitive man in Peru of the day the sun stood still. 23. The legends from Malayan and Sumatran tribal aborigines of the long night. 24. The Varve Earth strata, counts in Wrenchell, Minnesota, and Hackensack, New Jersey, which conform with each other. 25. The prevalence of jade in the Orient, which is material heaved up from the mantle, near equatorial pivot points during a cataclysm. 26. The fantastic evidence of burgeoning tropical plants in Arctic Siberia, Alaska and Antarctica, frozen and preserved for thousands of years in a fraction of a day during a cataclysm. 27. The similarity of languages the world over, from Polynesian to Greek, to Egyptian, to Mayan, to Eskimo, to Yakut, to Oriental and more. 28. The footprints of dinosaurs, imprinted in beds of exposed river mud, frozen before the prints could deteriorate, remaining frozen for thousands of years to allow the mud prints to ossify for us to see as dinosaur footprints in rock beds today. 29. The correlation of ice ages, stone ages, and quick extinctions of all species the world over. 30. The survival of primitive life at the equatorial pivot points, the last two being the Malay Peninsula and the Galapagos, both now rife with lizards. 31. I.e. existence of a coral reef on the floor of the Arctic Ocean. 32 and more and more and more and more give us a prehistoric picture of the positions of the Earth's shell during the past 35,000 or more years. The overwhelming evidence, when put in order, give a dramatic picture of which areas have been at the North Pole, when they moved to the pole, when they moved away from the pole, and how long they were there. Notice that the end of an era is the same as the start of the next era. Although the chart is in terms of years ago and years duration, do remember that the change from one era to the next occurs in a fraction of a day, short enough to be called abrupt. Yes, Noah, Adam and Eve, Osiris, Taroa, Zeus, and Vishnu have much deeper meaning now, and as they join hands and walk with us, we hear Adam and Eve saying, "Listen, for now we can truly share our story with you."
It's funny how some things can plague you from your childhood years through your adult years. Not big things, necessarily, but little things, which don't exactly persist, but annoyingly stick their heads through your life's door and say, "Boo," just to let you know they are still there. If I made a list of all these things in my life, it might take up a whole book. I'd like to talk about just one of these bugaboos. From the first time I heard the story of the creation and Adam and Eve, even as a child, it bothered me. To me, the answer wasn't simply one of two usual alternatives, either unquestioning faith in the story as it stands, or complete repudiation as utter nonsense. No, the answer seemed to lie elsewhere. If the story were taught as the truth so uniformly, in spite of its apparent divergence from scientific truths, then to me the true course would seem to be a search for the foundation of the story, which would then lead to a true leading of it. The pursuit happened almost by accident. Years of data correlation in studying cataclysmology has shown that the last cataclysm to have occurred about 7,000 years ago, that Noah, or Utnapishtim, or whatever his name was, did exist and did survive that cataclysm. A friend of mine suggested that Genesis 1 is almost a perfect description of conditions on our planet right after a cataclysm, including about a week following. On rereading it, I had to agree. Genesis 2 even mentions that a mist arose from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Well, now this was worth thinking about. If it were so, then, if it were so that it would be the cataclysm preceding Noah's about 11,500 years ago. This, then, could be approximately the time of the Adam and Eve story. The pursuit started. If the story did originate with that cataclysm, in what language was it first written? Certainly not Hebrew or Greek, for as far as we know, they didn't even exist at that time. Was it possible to delve into the vanished pages of prehistory and find both the language and the story as originally written? If we look to men such as Don Antonia Batters, Wariki and James Churchward, we may have our answer. Certainly, their knowledge of prehistoric languages could be key, and later we'll discuss the role of Nagas and ancient Mayan in the story of Adam and Eve. First, however, let's examine the history of Genesis 1, 2 and 3. There are many schools of thought on this subject, but the most predominant one is that Moses was the originator. This seems not obtuse since Moses was reared in Egyptian tradition in a royal household and probably had access to many religious writings and teachings now lost with the passing of the archives of Egypt, in Alexandria, Heliopolis and Sais. Certainly, the 10 Commandments were a condensation of the 42 questions of the Osiris for entering heaven. If Moses did write part of the Old Testament, he then must have had Nigar tablet writings, or Egyptian interpretations of them, handed down to the Egyptians for thousands of years through the royal households, and the Egyptian priesthood had knowledge of a cataclysm 11,500 years ago. Priests of Egypt are supposed to have told Solon during his 10 years in Egypt, about 600 BC, that 9,000 years before that time, there was a cataclysm which buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. Note that 9,000 plus 600 BC plus 1950 AD equals 11,550 years ago. Moses' brother Aaron became the first chief priest of the Hebrews about 1,300 BC. Somewhere between 15 and 18 generations later, the chief priesthood having been handed down from father to son through the generations, Saraiah was the chief priest. Later, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Sarah was executed, and his son Ezra made a captive in Persia. Jerusalem was sacked and all Hebrew laws and records of the Old Testament were burned with the temple at Jerusalem by Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's captain of the guard. In 458 BC, during the 7th year of our Artaxerxes' reign in Persia, Ezra was commissioned to re-establish the Hebrew religion and law. According to 2 Esdras, Ezra rewrote the history of the Hebrews from the beginning and re-established their laws. Now from 586 to 458 BC is 128 years. The latest that Ezra could have been born was, after his father Sarer's execution, as well could be, therefore, the youngest he could have been in 458 BC was 127. He was working on a long memory. Let's examine this anomaly. As mentioned before, the lineage from Aaron to Ezra contains from 17 to 20 generations, including Aaron and Ezra. Assuming 1300 BC to be the start of Aaron's priesthood, that's 1290 BC is adjudged the time of the Exodus, and 458 BC to be near the end of Ezra's priesthood, then we find the average priesthood term per generation to be between 42.1 and 49.5 years. In view of this, can we believe that Ezra served his priesthood for approximately 130 years? Which includes his entire lifespan. It would appear much more plausible to assume that it was Ezra's grandfather Azariah, rather than his father Sarer, who was the one taken and executed by Nebuchadnezzar's Sman in 586 BC. Then Sarer and Ezra would have served as chief priests from 586 to 458 BC, for an average of 64 years apiece. It is even plausible that Ezra's great-grandfather Hilkiah could have been the victim in 586 BC, leaving Azariah, Sarer and Ezra to serve the 128 years for an average of 42 years each, which is even closer to the overall average of 42.1 to 49.5 years from Aaron to Ezra, over a period of about 845 years. This means that the Adam and Eve story was last seen in writing by Hilkiah or Azariah, therefore handed down verbally, possibly by Azariah, and certainly by Sarer and Ezra, and finally dictated by Ezra to 5 scribes. It is the 5 scribes' writings that we have today as Ezra's work. And the English is not even a literal translation. For instance, without form and void, more literally, would read, raging inundations and horrendous winds. Now, through Ezra's reconstruction of Genesis, we are told many things. 1. Because of the use of tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, sword of fire, and other words of Moses which were glyphs in the picture language of prehistory, is evident that the creation and Adam and Eve stories were probably originally written in the glyphs of Niger, the predominant Eastern Hemisphere language of 11,500 years ago. This language is nearly identical to prehistoric Mayan, and the progenitor of many languages, which include Oriental and Polynesian tongues, Egyptian, Greek and Yakut. My own knowledge of prehistoric Niger and Mayan glyphs enables me to read many Indian blankets of the southwestern United States, which have woven into them colorful glyphs depicting a cataclysm. I wonder if the Indians are chuckling to themselves, knowing that the tourists think they are buying blankets of just pretty pictures. Yakut is an interesting language. It is almost pure spoken Niger. It is spoken by Alaskan Eskimos. The town of Yarkutat means the place where Yakut is spoken. It is also spoken by a native tribe in Turkey. Niger in almost its purest prehistoric form is spoken by a tribe in northern India. It is pure prehistoric Mayan. 2. Moses certainly, and possibly Aaron, had access to the Royal Egyptian Glyphstones library. 3. Neither Moses nor Aaron knew how to read the ancient glyph languages of Niger or Mayan, therefore read the glyphs quite literally. 4. Not being able to read the symbolism of the glyphs, in addition to reading them literally, Moses and Aaron, and possibly Ezra, read into the Adam and Eve story the social and religious attitudes of their day. In that time woman was regarded as the root of all sin, a lowly creature, her birth recorded only as an exception, and basically being the cause of man's every downfall, a daily potential. This attitude persists even in worse forms in some religions amazingly in our time. It is any wonder that Eve was shouldered with the responsibility for the downfall of all mankind, as a result of interpretations read into the Niger by Moses. And into Moses' reading by Ezra? Perhaps also it was read into the story by Egyptian priests long before Moses' time, and passed on to him verbally as history. If his father were really the one taken and executed by the captain of the guard, Nebuzaradan, then it had to be his grandfather who passed the story to him verbally. The fusing of 2 stories, P and J versions, into one make the story of Genesis 1, 2, and the third of may confuse the man with Adam. It is possible that Adam, being only 9 generations ahead of Noah, with the time span of the Sudan Basin Polar Era covering about 4,500 to 5,000 years, was not the man referred to in the creation, but his name and experiences were merged with the man's story. Remember, however, we are informed that Ezra dictated the entire history to 5 scribes from memory, and this work contains Genesis as we know it today. For him to recall from the archives of his mind what he did, as well as he did, certainly bespeaks of inspiration of a high order, but it also appears evident that he had no knowledge of the fact that 4,500 years transpired between Genesis 1 and Noah's flood. LT is clear from 2 Esdras 3:9 that Genesis 1 and Noah's flood were actually 2 inundations, however, for while speaking of the 2 occasions, he says of Noah's flood, and again in process of time that broughtest the flood upon those that dwelt in the world, and destroydst them. Now, we mentioned before that the lineage of the high priests from Aaron to Ezra differs in numbers of generations, 17 or 20, and names as presented in 1 and 2 Esdras, and both differ in names from the book of Ezra. We also find differences in the lineages from Noah to Jesus, approximately 51 generations, in the Bible. Is it any wonder, therefore, that some generations could have been omitted in the Adam to Noah line? Not to mention the Noah to Jesus line, and the Aaron to Ezra line. And in light of the fact that, in addition to overwhelming evidence, there are countless legends in the Asia-Pacific areas, handed down from the inundation of 11,500 years ago, of a creation much like that of Genesis 1 and 2, is it not possible that the man of the Genesis story became confused with Adam throughout the thousands of years, and through a succeeding cataclysm in Noah's time 7,000 years ago? The miracle is that the whole story of creation and of Adam and Eve is as undistorted as it is, being 11,500 years old. It has suffered through many debacles visited upon its guardians in the intervening years. Because of the lack of resolving information, the man and Adam are kept as one in this translation or interpretation. 6. The significant niggard-glyphs given to us by Ezra through Moses' direct reading are cherubims, rib, Adam's sleep, man, woman, tree, fruit on the tree, serpent, and flaming sword. Our knowledge of niggard-glyphs tells us that the tree of life symbolized a mother continent, a parent civilization lasting thousands of years longer than ours of today. An unadorned serpent represented water in its natural state, or the ocean, a serpent entwined around. The tree signified that the mother continent was surrounded entirely by water. Genesis 3:15 actually describes Eve's heel on the serpent's head, depicting her victory over the oceans. Cherubims, which were not pretty, plump babies as we have always thought, but glyphs of hybrid man and beast. They were the glyphs for legs, or foundations, or underpinnings. Instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden, the foundation was taken away, and a Nigar or Mayan reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead shows that cherubims of the north, south, east and west were taken away, meaning that all the foundations of the mother continent were removed and destroyed. The flaming sword was the symbol of fire and earthquake. The fire signified what all legends of these cataclysms call earth fire, which is the planet-wide molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell, breaking through to the surface during a cataclysm, a literal hell. It is, as far as I have been able to determine, the origin of man's concept of hell. I remember watching John Kennedy's funeral on television, and most vividly the incantation given by the Archbishop to keep John Kennedy from the doors of hell. His words went back to pre-Christian Rome, for in describing those gates of hell, he painted a picture of hell exactly like that of the molten sublayer breaking through the Earth's shell. It had to be handed down through thousands of years from one who had actually seen it. Chills ran up and down my spine as it stamped an indelible impression on my mind. Now to the tree. Fruit growing on that tree symbolized the mankind which settled the mother continent ages before Adam and Eve. Their eating the fruit tells us they were descended from this original mankind. Eve eating first signifies that she was the younger generation, Adam eating second signifies that he was her father, which made her his daughter. His daughter. Yes. It is the origin of one of the oldest Hebrew laws. In a catastrophe, if but a male and female survive, they must mate, regardless of their relationship. If you want to check on this, read the story of Lot and his 2 daughters. The daughters were simply obeying Hebrew law. He is stated to be too drunk to know what he was doing. Har. If he were, he couldn't have performed. He must have been a good actor. The glyph of the creation is even more revealing. There are 3 figures represented on the stone. The top figure is the face of a sleeping or dead person. There were no separate symbols for death and sleep in Niger, both were represented as the same. The middle figure is shown as a male, and the bottom figure a female who is represented as the mother of all mankind. In addition, there are curved lines from the sleeping or dead person and the male middle figure to the bottom of the female figure. This glyph has been interpreted to mean that the middle figure, a male, was put to sleep, shown by the top figure, and a rib, or ribs, removed from him, the ribs being the curved lines, and fashioned into the bottom figure, the female mother of all mankind. This, it's beautifully with the story of Eve's creation, Adam therefore being both the male middle figure and the top figure, a sleeping or dead person. There is a hitch to this story, however, the top figure, either sleeping or dead, is depicted as a female. How could it be Adam, asleep, awake, dead or alive? Moreover, in Niger the curved lines denote parentage rather than ribs, so, more reasonably, it appears that the top figure is a dead female, whose offspring by the male middle figure, Adam, was the bottom female figure, Eve, the mother of all mankind. I have been asked countless times how one can tell the top figure to be a dead female, to the extent that I guess I owe an answer here. In Niger and prehistoric Mayan, they show that they worshipped but one deity, and represented that deity by a glyph of a circle representing the sun. Any time a circle was shown on a tablet, it could only represent their deity. This tablet has 2 circles on it. Purists have stated that the writers of this tablet meant to show double intensity of the deity. Strange, I have never seen anywhere a double intensity of 2 circles in either Niger or prehistoric Mayan. The curious thing about these 2 circles is that they are located precisely where a female's breasts should be on the top figure. Maybe that's what double intensity is all about. The most curious thing about this stone is that it fits the legend of Adam being a widower, and the name of his deceased wife being Lilith. If true, it would also reveal Lilith to be Eve's mother. So, in essence, the story as read from the glyphs would be that Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden on the mother continent, tree, were descended from the original mankind, fruit, of that land, which incidentally was surrounded entirely by water, serpent entwined around the tree. Eve was Adam's daughter, and he was a widower. They realized that, in order to survive, they had to leave and never try to return, for the motherland was destined to be destroyed by a cataclysmic inundation. Eve had perceived this coming event, and Adam asked her how she had discovered it. She answered that she had inherited the intelligence to do so from her ancestors. As a result, she had gained victory over the inundation, Eve's heel on the serpent's head. They left the motherland, and afterward the continent, tree, was subjected to a fiery earthquake, flaming sword, during which it lost its foundations, cherubims, and sank beneath the ocean, serpent, which remained forever afterward burying the continent, forever afterward crawling on its belly. So let's review the event, 2 cataclysms ago, and then apply our knowledge toward a representative translation interpretation of Genesis I, 2, and 3. It may be the most accurate reading of a story written 11,500 years ago.